So here we are, Bonelab Patch 4 finally dropped. I know I'm a little bit late to getting around to this, but that's for good reason. So the reason why I haven't been covering Bonelab and specifically Patch 4, well, that's because I was busy using the modding tools that Stress Level 0 has given us to build levels. So over the past few weeks, I've been utilizing the SDK to build out a multi-level story mod that takes place in the Bonelab universe. So the mod is called Endless, and it is a loose multi-level story where you play as a member of Lava Gang after the events of destroying a Monogon facility. So whether you care about the premise of the mod or not, that's not really what's important. I definitely designed the levels to be as Boneworks/Bonelab-esque as possible, and I wanted to make the player feel like they were actually going to be existing in that world, or that these would actually be a part of the actual base game. So as you're playing through each level, I hope you do see the elements that I incorporated to try and make it feel like a Bonelab/Boneworks game. So the footage that you're actually seeing in the background is from my mod, and I'll go ahead and leave a link to that in the description below. If you're watching this video, this mod is out now. So in the rest of this video, I figured I would cover some of the aspects of the most recent update that many aren't going to see, and this would be some of the tools that Stress Level 0 has implemented in Patch 4 for modders specifically. So I think a lot of people were expecting actual content to come in Patch 4, and really the content that came in Patch 4 was the new SDK tools. There was a lot of quality of life improvements that were implemented in this patch that modders can utilize within Unity to help streamline mods, make levels, which is primarily what I work in. And so what I primarily want to discuss in this video is talking about the changes that Stress Level 0 has incorporated to the SDK and how that's made it, easier for level makers like myself to create levels. So some of the areas that I want to touch on are the zone creation, the zone events, level loading, zone music and ambience, as well as scene chunking. So for any of you that were fortunate enough to play one of my first modded levels, which was Infiltration, I put that out about 4 months ago, and that was one of my first mods ever created. I had no idea what I was doing, and I was just building to build and just experimenting with level design, and I had no experience in Unity whatsoever. To my surprise, the reception to that mod was very well. I think to this day it has over 20,000 downloads, and people are always asking me to bring it to Patch 4. Unfortunately, I do not have the file anymore. Being new to Unity, I lost it and didn't save a backup. So unfortunately, that's probably gone forever. However, since then, I've put out a few other maps, including Labyrinth, Disruption, Escape Monogon, and then Z-Chamber, who I worked on with another friend of mine, Daytrip, who did a phenomenal job in helping me with that mod. So why am I bringing all this up? Why am I talking about prior modded maps that I've worked on? Well, I think it's important to realize from where we started to where we are today with level authoring tools and what's possible in the SDK that we have today. So I think the biggest change that Stress Level 0 has incorporated in this update is the zones and the zone event system. So while the zones are good for organization of level making in general, they also serve performance purposes that the player won't actually realize is occurring as they're going through playing a level. So let's say you have a zone A, zone B, and zone C. And zone C is way far away, not even in line of sight of A or B. Essentially what happens is those objects in zone C aren't even loaded into the game. They're there physically, but they aren't loaded into the game, giving you better performance overall. So it's not having to load in every single object on the game as you're playing it, therefore giving you better performance overall. So along with zones, we are also given zone events, and zone events are probably the best feature to come in this update. So to boil down zone events, it's simply game logic. And this game logic says, okay, if the player does this needs to happen. So a good example of a zone event utilized in my map Endless would be a player crosses a box collider, which triggers a intercom announcement to the player. Another good example of a zone event would be, okay, I have a player and he's walking through the door, but before he walks through the door, I want these NPCs to spawn and I want them to aggro towards the player. So zone events can be as complex or as easy as you want them to be, and overall I think it's a great quality of life update that they've introduced with this update. So in keeping in the spirit with zones, they've also introduced zone music as well as zone ambience, and these are huge because it just allows you to easily add ambient sounds as well as zone music. So the ambient sounds are actually really cool. So you can make a sound of like sewer pipes, you can make sound of the void, you can make it sound like a large cave, a small cave, a narrow corridor, a large concrete room, and really it just adds different reverberations to the sound effects in game. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was scene chunks, and I think this has the most potential for any level creator. Okay, so you're probably wondering what is a scene chunk, and to boil it down simply, a scene chunk is simply geometry or objects in a room or a zone that can be loaded and unloaded on when the player gets near them or is distant away from them. It'll unload those objects. So to boil it down even simpler, it's simply just the game saying, okay, if the player can only see these 2 or 3 zones, let's only load these 3 zones in. We don't need to load the whole map, therefore taking up performance from the player's hardware. So why is this a big deal? Well, essentially you can make fairly expansive levels without sacrificing performance, and I know Quest is a huge performance drag on the game. So in regard to scene chunking and Endless, I didn't utilize this tool whatsoever. I had some trouble trying to figure out how to use it, and I know there's tutorials from Stress Level 0, but I think I'm gonna have to work on a smaller project to implement scene chunking to better understand it myself. Patch 4 was a great quality of life update for Bonelab. There's still some key elements in the SDK that are missing, and I'd be lying to say I used the base SDK to build this map, because ultimately I did use the extended SDK. Now to my knowledge, the biggest difference between the extended SDK and Stress Level 0's base SDK is the inclusion of grips. Now grips are important because it allows players to interact with the level as well as interact with mods that can be made using grips. So for example, if you were trying to chamber a gun, you'd want to be able to grip the barrel. Another good example is if you had a piece of geometry, so let's say one of the Bonelab pipes, so one of the blue or yellow pipes, if you wanted to climb that, you have to physically add grips to those objects in order for the player to be able to climb those. So that's something that doesn't exist in the base SDK. Now I imagine grips are going to be something that they include in a later patch for the SDK, but I can't imagine why they wouldn't be implementing that now without a technical limitation that they're experiencing, so we'll have to wait and see. I think to sum up patch 4, while there was little content added in the game, I think it was a more under the hood improvement and overall a better quality of life experience for modders today. So I think if you haven't already, it would be worth your time to download the SDK and actually tinker around with it and play around with level making and just see what goes into actually designing a level to have an appreciation for those that actually create levels and create mods in general. So I think at the end of the day, it's just really cool to be able to use the same tools that Stress Level 0 is using to build our own maps and levels and mods and just keep the content interesting and fresh. And I do hope that with future updates to the SDK, they don't require us to update our mods. A better way to say this is at least to not the extent of what patch 4 did to all the patch 3 mods. I think the future for Bonelab looks bright. It sounds like the development schedule is kind of laid out before us. I know there have been rumors around 6 weeks is the cadence of updates that Stress Level 0 wants to get out. I wouldn't put a hard deadline on that, but if we can get some sort of routine, that would be fantastic. But yeah, that's going to do it for me. If you haven't already, consider downloading Endless. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Thanks so much for watching the video, and we'll see you in the next one.